Good morning.
Good morning.
Thank you for coming back for day two of our co-promoted, co-hosted Symposium on Innovations in Prosecution with the Association of Prosecuting Attorneys. I think we had a great day yesterday of fascinating conversations, interesting ideas, and terrific execution, punctuated by collegiating. So today we get to do more of the same, and it's my absolute pleasure and privilege to introduce Jami Hodge from the Vera Institute, who will be talking about racial justice. Jami is a 12-year veteran of the Washington, D.C. U.S. Attorney's Office, which, as I'm sure all of you know, while it's a federal office, it handles all of the local crimes that are committed in the District of Columbia as well. So it has a sort of cross-functioning of U.S. Attorney's Office and District Attorney's Office functions. She's also been in a variety of policy roles in the Obama administration, including the Office of Legal Policy and working with the Office of the Vice President. And she's going to talk today about a really innovative program that Vera has put together that basically ensures that improved racial awareness and bias awareness is being taught to frontline prosecutors so that that knowledge can inform the way that they go about their jobs. So please join me in welcoming Jami Hodge.
I'm all set. Good morning, everybody. It is wonderful to be with you. I'm very excited to talk about the topic we're going to discuss today. I'm first just going to make sure I get my slides pulled up so that we are ready to go. It's a PDF, so I'll go back to the beginning. Better? Okay, great. As John told you a little bit about me, one thing that I like to stress when I talk to people is that although I was at a federal office, that the bulk of my experience was on the local side, particularly because so much of the work we do now through our Reshaping Prosecution program is with local DAs. And so that's the lens that I really bring to this work. I'll talk just a little bit about Vera. As you know, is a nonprofit criminal justice reform organization that has been working really with data-driven processes for more than 50 years. Vera, really, we consider ourselves inside lane. We partner with system actors, again, with the goal of using data to drive policy and practice change. So today, we're going to talk about racial inequity in the criminal legal system and why it is important, as we are focused so much on the problem of mass incarceration, that we be as equally focused on addressing racial inequity. We're going to talk about why and how we help frontline prosecutors understand why these issues are important, how it should influence the work that they do every day. And then I'm just going to go through a few ways that we're able to help. And then that will be our time. And I certainly will leave plenty of time for question and answer, and really look forward to engaging with you on these topics. So as we stand here in Philadelphia, we all know that there is a spotlight on prosecutors, and that since 2015, really for the first time, we see prosecutors who are running on platforms of decarceration, of addressing racial disparities, of doing something different than the traditional approach to crime. And not only are we seeing them run, but we're seeing them win. And prosecutors are getting elected on these platforms, and communities are literally demanding something different from their elected. But just as we have this time where we're focused on prosecutors, we also find ourselves at an interesting time in our country, where really for the first time we are in media and in other ways really reckoning with our history. Everything from the 1619 project that I don't know how many have had the time to do any of the reading, but there's also an amazing podcast for those of us who don't always have time to read that really is just about helping us understand a history that isn't really taught in schools, that we've done really a terrible job of either erasing or rewriting, and how important it is for us to reckon with that history. In those first two slides, and I just want to ask by show of hands if who here has heard about the Equal Justice Initiative's Legacy Museum and National Memorial to Peace and Justice. Can you raise your hands if you, okay, and how many have been? Can you raise your hands if you've been? Okay, so there are a few of us. I can't stress enough how important it is and what a jewel Brian Stevenson has given us as this real tool for us to understand both our history of slavery, our history of racial injustice, our history of white supremacy, and how that history plays into the problems we see today in mass incarceration and the racial disparities we see in our system. So if you have any opportunity to get to Montgomery to experience that museum and that memorial, it is an amazing educational experience, and it is also a closing argument. You don't walk away, you can't walk away without understanding how deeply rooted our current system today is tied to our history and how we have an obligation to do something about it. So our program, Reshaping Prosecution, really was created in response to this moment we have in history. So this isn't Vera's first time being in the prosecution and racial justice space. Folks who've been in this space, who know criminal justice reform, may know that Vera ran a prosecution and racial justice program from 2005 to 2014. But this version, and I came to Vera just a year and a half ago. I left the U.S. Attorney's Office a year and a half ago to come lead this new body of work, is really in response to this movement. It's in response to prosecutors running on these platforms and winning, and response to this time where we are reckoning with our history and really ready to dive deep on racial justice issues. And so our program has three goals. We work with prosecutors towards the goals of ending mass incarceration, to addressing racial inequity in our system, and then to increasing transparency and accountability. So this isn't new to anyone here in this room. I know many of you are aware of the problem of mass incarceration in this country. And just what this map shows is that we incarcerate more than any place on the planet. And I'm not nearly as technologically advanced as Marissa was yesterday with using the cell phones to log in and vote. So I'm going to do some things the old-fashioned way. But, first, I'm going to ask, by show of hands, and this is a question I ask whenever I get a chance to talk to people. If you don't mind just raising your hands and sharing if you have had a loved one, whether that's a family member or a close friend, or sometimes it's personally, have had experience with our criminal legal system. So can we just by show of hands? And just look around. So this is everywhere I go, that this problem is now touching everyone. Forward released some recent numbers that shows that incarceration is now touching nearly half of American families. So our system has grown and is out of control. And for those who've had to live through it or have loved ones close to you, you also know that their incarceration experience didn't make them better. So they weren't better for it. And so we're really at this time where we now have to do something different. But again, what I want to leave with you and what we're going to talk about is that something different has to include addressing racial inequity. So what we know is that certain communities are more impacted by the growth of our systems. While again, it's touching nearly half of American families, we know in Black and brown communities, and particularly in Black communities, that the system is having a significant, devastating impact. So what this slide shows is in our jail population that a Black person is 3.6 times more likely to be incarcerated than a white person. And then we know that number actually only increases when we talk about our prison population, where a Black person is 5.3 times more likely to be incarcerated than a white person. And so what that means in layman's terms is when we think about Black babies, baby boys born today, that 1 in 3 can expect to spend time in prison. And then when we think about a Latino baby boy born today, that 1 in 6 can expect to spend time in prison, compared to 1 in 17, which, you know, and not that we really want anyone, but 1 in 17 certainly is a much better number than 1 in 3 and 1 in 6. So what do we do about this? And what is the obligation on prosecutors to address these issues? What we know, again, not just in dealing with the problem of mass incarceration, but in addressing these issues, that prosecutors play a powerful role. This is what excites me so much about this moment in time we're in, that there's this real recognition that the discretion, that the power that prosecutors have, while often being demonized and sort of being told as being the drivers of mass incarceration, that actually that same power and discretion is what can drive change and what can be the solution. And so it really, though, is going to require us to have a fundamental rethinking about what the role of the prosecutor is. And that just can't be with the elected. You know, again, excited about the folks running on these platforms, excited that communities are using their voice and electing them. But what we know in larger offices are they are not the ones going to court every day. The hard work of the court cases and dealing with victims and dealing with officers and doing investigation, that's done by the line staff. And that's why it's critically important that we involve them in these conversations. So how do we do that? And what are some of the ways that we work with line prosecutors around understanding their role differently? We like to begin our conversations around values. And one of the questions I always ask it's usually the first question, when I'm in a room full of prosecutors, is what brought you to this job? And we go around and every person names why they took this job. And even as I ask that question, I'd ask you to just reflect for a moment, you know, why you wanted to be a prosecutor, why you took that step. And it usually isn't because you wanted to lock up as many people as possible. When we think about what drove us to want to be prosecutors, it is the lofty ideals of the pursuit of justice. It is the pursuit of truth. It is working with victims. It's caring deeply about public safety. It is those values that drive really what brings people in. But what we are able to show them is how the current system operates, often in ways that are not consistent with those values. And it also requires us to recenter, have a new lens, I would say, of those same values where we center racial equity. So it's not just about what safety means, but safety means for whom. And I'll just share a personal example. You know, part of my time at the U.S. Attorney's Office was working as a community prosecutor, where my role, I was assigned to the 5th District in Washington, D.C., which includes a lot of the northeast part of the city. My office was literally in the back of the report writing room at the 5th District Police Station in D.C. And so my job was really community outreach. I was responsible for the same part of the city 5D, the police district, was responsible for. And so it was a lot of partnership around community outreach. You know, I was responsible for doing their roll call trainings, reviewing their warrants, and really being a source of just advice for them, which meant I got to know officers in a really different way. You know, I'd been working with officers for years, obviously having cases and being a line prosecutor, but sitting in their report writing room and really in their business at their 2:30 a.m. roll calls to train them and the 10:30 roll call to train them, really opened my eyes, you know, to not just the difficult nature of the job it is they have, but really often the costs personally for them it is to do the work that they do. And so I named that I have had an experience and exposure where I have the utmost respect for the people who run towards the problem when the rest of us are running away. But even with that exposure and knowing so many of them on personal levels, knowing their wives, knowing the names of their children, when I am pulled over by a police officer, I immediately have my heart racing, hands sweating. It is a fearful experience for me. When my 16-year-old nephew, who turned 16 this year, I knew he'd be driving, and I'm like, I don't care if your mom has had to talk with you. I don't care if your dad has had to talk with you. I want to have the talk with you. I want to know what you're going to do when, not if, when you're pulled over by a police officer and how you know how to handle yourself. And that talk to me was urgent because it wasn't just about making sure you don't get a ticket. What I'm concerned about is that you come out alive. And so that is me, someone who knows officers well, who still keeps in touch with some of the officers I work closely with. And so it's not a demonization, it's just the reality. You know, that there are so many underlying issues that have led to the interactions that communities of color have with police. So when we talk about safety with our line prosecutors, it's asking the question, safety for whom? And what does safety look like? And safety from the view of the communities that you're serving. The same thing with the concept of justice. And I hope in most offices that prosecutors are being told to pursue justice. I know that is not in every office. There are still the offices where they're told to get convictions. But I think in the good offices, prosecutors are told it's not about the conviction, it's about justice. And that was certainly how I was brought up as a prosecutor. But my concept of justice and what was shared with me was justice in that case. And so I did my investigation, I learned all the facts that I needed to know, I looked at the appropriate statutes, and what was a just outcome. And that was the question I asked. I was never asked to zoom out about a view of justice. In 12 years, I never heard the term mass incarceration inside my office. That was just not something, weren't words that are used. That's another place I'll ask a question. Those who are in a prosecutor's office, have been in a prosecutor's office, can you raise your hand if you talked about or heard the words mass incarceration? And I know there's a number of Philly folks in here as well. But that makes me happy to see that there were a good number of hands raised. There were still a number of hands that weren't. And I actually think, you know, given where we are, the type of conference we're in, that the numbers are probably a little skewed here. I think in most prosecutors' offices across this country, that's just not what the focus is on. And it's not, again, to blame. You know, prosecutors are working hard. They have so many cases, so many responsibilities. Who has time to zoom out and think beyond the next court date and the next trial and all the voicemails you need to return? But it is imperative that we help them do so, and that is part of what we do. And so when you zoom out and have a different understanding of what justice means, what you see then is that we have a national crisis. And then what you see then is that our punitive approach is actually not making us safer. And so just exposing literally to the data, you know, showing how as a country with only 5% of the world's population, that we have between 22 and 25% of the world's incarcerated population. And also showing them that it wasn't always this way. That in the early 70s, we incarcerated at rates similar to similar situated countries, but that there were intentional decisions made by government actors to change our approach and to increase our reliance on punitive responses to harm, and that is how we got here. So giving them an opportunity to just be exposed to what justice looks like when we zoom out. And when you're exposed to that information and as ministers of justice, also understanding an obligation to do something about it. You know, that part of how you pursue justice in your role as a line prosecutor requires to understand what the consequences are of the decisions that I make, not just in this case, but systemically, and where we see these disparities, to have an obligation to address them. And I'm not going to go through all of these, but the other example I'd give is truth. Clearly, that is something that is held out as a core value for prosecutors. It's not necessarily just, again, about trying to prove that a person did it. It's trying to make sure you have the right person identified, that you have the right evidence, that the evidence is reliable, that the witnesses are credible. It's about the pursuit of truth. But again, expanding that definition, especially through a racial equity lens. So not just truth, again, in that particular case, but what does truth look like when we have to consider the truth of how our system got here, how we have to consider the truth of who this person is on the other side of your decision. So that there's more facts and more that you should know and consider that's other than just the credibility of the witnesses, but that truth is a broader concept. And so we have these discussions and we do this work really through trainings. And again, as I mentioned, it's exposing to the problems of mass incarceration just so that prosecutors are aware of the basic information that at least I know in my experience, I never heard of. Again, to just bring some of the history to the prosecutors that I've literally had to spend the last year and a half learning on my own. And I think part of it also is just to kind of remove the shame and stigma, you know, as lawyers, as people who are very educated, as really often the authority in a courtroom that the judge relies on, there can be like a sense of shame about things that we don't know. And one thing I really appreciate about Jeff Robinson at the ACLU, who does an amazing 3-hour training on chronicling our history of racism in this country and walking through literally the source documents. It's an amazing presentation. You have an opportunity to see it. And it's something he'll bring. He'll bring the offices, and there have been offices in this country where he's come and brought this training. But I really appreciate just his humility. You know, he's Harvard educated and will say, I didn't learn this stuff until I was in my 50s and had to go teach myself. So, you know, like just to name, like there's a lot that we don't know because it is not taught, but that doesn't mean that we don't have an obligation to learn it. And then again, really leaving them with the message that we're not just here to beat you down and tell you all the problems and tell you how the system is causing harm and how communities of color are being impacted by these harms. We're here to inspire you, and particularly because usually where we're going are offices where there is a DA who has been elected on a platform of change, a DA who is trying to do something different in their office. And so we tell them, like, you are in this unique position because we still have 2,300 offices in this country, and we just have a small number who have really taken on these platforms of change. And so you're at the forefront of this movement and having this opportunity to do something different with the power and discretion that you have, and share with them examples of ways that that is happening across the country. And so part of these conversations is just also sort of kind of taking down the myths of why prosecutors do what they do. And really, again, showing the values that bring them to this role and then how the system as it operates in its current form doesn't add up. And so part of what we show through survey data and other information is that a reliance on incarceration actually isn't making us safer. I mean, based on that first slide, as being the place that incarcerates more than any place on the planet, we should all be able to leave our doors open. We should be able to leave our keys in our car. We shouldn't have to worry about anything if incarceration equals safety. But we know that's not the case. So just, helping them recognize like so much of what we do in the name of public safety isn't working, and that it's time to maybe think differently. A recognition that the system itself causes harm. For many prosecutors, and I know I was one of them, after sentencing, I packed that jacket and all those files, and it goes off the closed files, and finally that's one I can cross off my list. I can turn back to the next one, and I don't give another thought to what now that period of incarceration means for that individual's family, for their children, for their community. That's just not something I thought much about. And not just on the back end, just really being exposed to the fact that even on the front end, so many people are detained, even if it's just for 3 days to get their hearing to see if they can be released, that even just 3 days can be extremely destabilizing. Loss of jobs, loss of homes. It can lead to the loss of custody of children in just those short period of time. And so to be thoughtful about how we request detention and why we're requesting detention, and really understanding and being more proximate to the impacts of detention. And then just that victims, so much of what we do, again, is in the name of victims. This is how we get justice for the victim, but exposing them to amazing survey data from the Alliance and Safety Justice Survey and from the National Crime Victims Survey that shows us that victims are not satisfied. And if we're honest about our own practice, we know that, a lot of times a victim will call the police, and how hard it will be to get them to actually come in and to see the process through. That much of what we do is not centered on their needs. And I'll just share again, just personally, so not only I raised my hand as being personally impacted by having incarceration impact my immediate family, and that's my brother who, with his permission, I share openly about his story. He ended up getting a felony conviction and serving time behind a substance use disorder, one that we as a family didn't even know existed. He had been battling this since a teenager, but he was very good at hiding and very high functioning. And the first I learned of it was as a young prosecutor getting a call from him in a jail cell. And that rocked my world. He had never been in trouble before, never been arrested before. And, and yes, having not had a record and not been in trouble, he was given initially a period of probation and, given a chance. But the way substance use disorder works doesn't mean the first time you're arrested and exposed to treatment means you got it. And so he struggled, and behind that spent a year incarcerated, behind that spent time in solitary confinement, had 32 felony convictions, all from just, it was returning items and keeping the money, and so the overcharging that it needed to be all 32 felony convictions that he pled to, and just seeing personally that impact on what incarceration meant. And I can tell you, I never looked at another drug possession case the same, having really been exposed just from my own brother's situation. But then also on the other side, when we talk about victims and what they need, also while seeing the failures of the system on that end, my father was the victim of a violent robbery when I was in high school. We still don't know today if it was a bat or a brick that they used to hit him in the head, but he suffered a severe closed head injury. That didn't just change his life, it changed all of our lives. And, to nearly lose him, to have to watch him fight, to regain basic functions like eating, talking, walking, and for him to still deal with the impacts of that today, I can tell you the one thing that we didn't do was call the police and ask what happened, or ask for really anything from the criminal system. That wasn't going to make us whole. It wasn't going to help us with the new reality of our life. So, the system is failing on both ends. It's failing victims who are often not even engaging. I think for me, as a former prosecutor, one of the most sort of stark statistics from the survey data was the fact that nearly half of victims of violent crime don't engage at all. They don't call. And how many people are suffering, are dealing with trauma, doing that in silence. And that's what all our system has to offer. I mean, we have victim services. We have resources and things that are available. And with all we have to offer, half of victims of violent crime choose nothing. So it's, again, just the reality of why we took these jobs and why we're trying to do this hard work. It certainly wasn't for the money. I'm sure everybody would agree why you signed up to be a prosecutor, but to really have to reckon with our system isn't working. And then finally, again, exposing to some of the history, and we're going to walk through a couple of those slides that shows the intentionality behind how we got here in terms of racial disparity. So this is a quote from President Nixon's domestic policy chief. This is something that I encountered in the EJI Legacy Museum, and I'll just read it. It says, "We knew we couldn't make it illegal to be either against the war or blacks, but by getting the public to associate the hippies with marijuana and blacks with heroin, and then criminalizing both heavily, we could disrupt those communities. We could arrest their leaders, raid their homes, break up their meetings, and vilify them night after night on the evening news. Did we know we were lying about the drugs? Of course we did." And so there are a number of examples that show the real intentionality behind how things were criminalized, the penalties that were associated with it, and this is just one example. I'm just going to play this. Oh, sorry, give me 1 second. Thank you, John. I am not the technological person. I always pulled it up. Oh, there it is. There we go.
criminal justice system is broken. It is only broken to the extent that our system is working as intended. It is only broken to the extent that our society is broken. If your intention is to, jail massive numbers of people, if you believe that prison is an effective means of dealing with the myriad social needs of the African American community, then it's pretty effective. In fact, there's a long history in this country of dealing with problems in the African American community through criminal justice system, criminalizing social problems in a way we don't do in other communities. For instance, if you looked at the research, you would find that somewhere around 60 to 70% of the people in prisons and in jails are suffering some sort of mental health problem. Upwards of 50% going there dealing with some sort of chemical dependency. Viewed from another lens, these are public health problems. One could look at the massive number of African American men who are out of work, and the intersection between that and prison. Well, one could look at where prisons are located, and you would find that a lot of times prisons are located in rural regions, where all other industries effectively shut down. And you might think of that as actually an employment problem and not a criminal justice problem. The enduring view of African Americans in this country is as a race of people who are prone to criminality. I mean, literally, we have a notion of black people as criminals written into our Constitution. We have a fugitive slave clause, which effectively makes all the things that are normal for any other American in that period illegal for black people. To pursue your own freedom was illegal. Slavery, was enforced by the criminal justice system, the slave laws. It made, very, very ordinary things like learning to read effectively a criminal act. Frederick Douglass is an escaped slave. He's a criminal. He's stolen his body, as he says in one of his speeches. Harriet Tubman, is running a massive criminal conspiracy, stealing. I know we all love Martin Luther King today, but in his time, by the highest powers in the American justice system, Martin Luther King was viewed as a criminal, by J. Edgar Hoover. Arguably, perhaps by the Kennedy administration and the Johnson administration. I say that because they signed off on the bugging, of his home and wherever he was. The lens of criminal justice is the way this country has traditionally regarded black people. I don't know that anything is broken at all. The deeper question is, are we okay with something on the order of 4,000 African American males per 100,000 being in jail? Are we okay with that? Are we okay with there being a 1 in 3 chance for every African American born in this generation, or eventually doing some sort of time in prisons and in jail? Are we all right with that? And that goes to the deeper question of, are we all right with black people in the position that they are in our society? Or do we have some sort of long-term commitment to justice?
And so that was the amazing Ta-Nehisi Coates, whose voice you heard. But that's just an example of the type of media also that we use in our training. We definitely try not to just talk at the prosecutors the entire time. And then this slide is just making the point that we know that this history isn't tied just to our criminal legal system, but that there are in other ways, the ways the government took affirmative steps to either disenfranchise or disempower communities of color, from the founding of the Social Security Act, which carved out originally the occupations held by black and brown people, from the redlining, which I know everyone has heard about, through the Federal Housing Administration, which made it difficult for mortgages to be approved and given in communities where black people live. So this, again, the point of this is, it's not, not to shame our country, our government. It really is just to spur what we have always failed to do, which is a reckoning. So part of the amazing work that Vera has done over the years is exposing prosecutors, governors, media folks to other systems. And so America's not the only place that has suffered with a history of racial injustice. I think what makes us different is that when we look at countries like Germany, we look at places like Rwanda and South Africa, where we've seen these issues happen, there's been a truce and then reckoning or reconciliation process. And then, as what we see now in Germany, the way that they've addressed it is literally elevating human dignity in their constitution. You know, it's written into their constitution, it's written into how they respond to harm through their criminal legal system. And so that leads to a very different system. And so when we take people over there and when they're exposed to what prison looks like there and how prison really is a place where a person has a key to their room and they come out of their room where they're experiencing the therapy and the training and all the things that prepare them to come back home, and you compare that to what our prison system looks like, we see the stark difference between what happens when you elevate human dignity and when we just use the system for punishment. And again, it's not lost, and again, the museum is amazing at this, on the similarities between what exists in our current conditions of confinement and what existed in slavery. So everything from the shackling, from the removal of names and use of numbers, to the abusive treatment, to the lack of access to adequate health care, to mold in facilities, and to just the inhumane conditions in terms of food, in terms of treatment. How much of it, you know, even there's on some of the longer presentations, we have slides that show like the pictures of the slave holding cells compared to the cells that we use today. And the similarities are clear. So again, just the need for us as a country to reckon with our history so that we just have a better approach. When we send people away, we know that 95% are coming home. But what we aren't thinking about is the fact that research shows us that there are certain core drivers of violence that make people more inclined to be violent. And there are things like isolation, it's shame, it's lack of inability to take care of oneself economically. And then we send them to a place where it's the exact same exposure to shame, to isolation. It's also exposure to violence. And that we send them to a place where basically those same factors that drive violence, they're exposed to while they're away, and then they come home and we expect something different. And so we just, again, have to really think about what we're doing in this country with our system, and is this really how we make our country more safe? So what can line prosecutors do about this? You know, so clearly they aren't wardens, and you know, and the prosecution function really doesn't have a lot to do with conditions of confinement. But there are lots of ways we can elevate human dignity in our practice. And so we try to give concrete ways that don't require that you be the executive, that you be the policymaker, that you, I don't care if it's your first day on the job or, you know, you're 5 or 10 years in, what are things you can do to elevate human dignity in your practice? And so this is just one example. And what this quote is about is using people-centered language. And I, you know, will be the first to admit that I did not refer to the people I was prosecuting as people, you know, defendants, felons, offenders, you know, and certainly there across our halls were lots of worse language. And so, you know, and we're taught, I was trained, you know, that when I'm standing in front of a jury, I don't say Mr. such and such, I say the defendant, because I don't want the jury to see this individual as a person. And if we really just step back and ask ourselves, does having someone be held accountable for the harm they cause really require that we dehumanize them, that we take their human dignity away? But it is so ingrained in how we operate. And so something as simple as changing language is literally felt as revolutionary. And the number of rooms I stood in and said this and had prosecutors shaking their head like, what are you talking about? You know, but this is simple. And change just begins. This is how change begins. It can be the little things. And this feels little, but again, just knowing how ingrained this is in the culture and the way we practice, how different this is. really, another important thing that we talk to them about, and we think it's important for prosecutors to do, is to get to know the person on the other side of the decisions that you're making. I always found it strange, like in our practice in DC, that the time that I learned the most about the person I've been prosecuting, this could be an investigation that's been going on a year and a half, before we get to a trial or get to a plea, and then we're at basically sentencing. So the time I learned the most was in a pre-sentence report that we usually got a few weeks before sentencing. And that was the time that I learned about the unstable home, the often, particularly in my violent crime cases, the trauma the person had experienced, often beginning when they were very young, and learned just all of the things that really contributed to the why, like why this person made the choice they did, why they committed that act that they did. And we just need to do better about learning that information, not at the point of just sentencing. And again, I know there are offices around the country who have a better system where there are mitigation packets brought by defense counsel, and there is a real opportunity for prosecutors to learn more about the person, even as they're making their early decisions. But that's not the case across many places in this country. And just putting the onus on the prosecutor. You can ask your defense counsel, can you help me understand a little bit about how this happened, why it happened? Tell me more about this person. Just because all of that, it's to move us away from just a sole focus on punishment as a response, but really to help prosecutors see their role as problem solvers. And when we know, as some of the data has shown, and as you know just from your own practice, when this system has become the backstop for all the other failures, from everything to substance use and mental health and poverty-based things, that just a punitive response is not how we're going to fix this. And the way that you can be better problem solvers are just to ask the questions and to work with defense counsel to know more. And then when you do have a little bit more power, this is a slide that we borrowed from one of our site partners in St. Louis City. And so this is something that the head of the charging unit uses there to basically own a responsibility to do something about the racial disparities that we showed them in their data. And so knowing what neighborhoods are being targeted by the police, and knowing, again, and if I had more time, I'd show you some of the slides, and if you want more information, I'm happy to provide it. But we have, the amazing work of the Stanford's project on traffic stops, and showing how literally the racial disparities in who stopped. And what was so fascinating is when the sun goes down, and you can't really see how those disparities drop significantly. But then also that what the information shows is that the fruit of those traffic stops, in terms of who has contraband, that you're actually more likely to find contraband on the white people who are stopped than on the black people who are stopped. But yet black people are stopped at such significantly more rates. So if you know that, if you know there's particular targeting, bias is at play and who's stopped and who's contacted, to just be aware of it and to have a sensitivity to it and to apply some extra scrutiny when you know it's an area that's being sort of with boots on the ground and the police are sort of flooding that particular area. The power of charging is clearly another way. Again, recognizing that this has become the backstop for all these failures, really asking yourself, by adding a conviction to this, does this actually help? Is this making it any better? So using declination policies, using diversion, and then just recognizing that even where punishment is necessary, do we have to do it to the extent that we do it? It's not just that we incarcerate more. We have slides that we share with the line staff that we also incarcerate for longer, So I am not an abolitionist. We will always have a jail and prison system. There will always be people who need to be put away for some period of time so that they don't harm anyone. But do we have to throw lives away forever? Do we have to stack and pursue the highest possible charge? Do we have to, ask for everything to be consecutive? To really be thoughtful about how long? To think about opportunities to see if 5 years from now, 10 years from now, is that person the same person? because God willing, I pray I'm not. I certainly am not who I was 10 years ago, but we don't have many mechanisms for that in our system. It's the sentencing is made, the case is closed, it's gone away, and just really being thoughtful about, how long and the amount of time and what is necessary. And again, I mentioned this a little bit earlier, but just being aware of on the front end, how destabilizing even short jail stays can be. I think I didn't mention a startling statistic that most of the suicides that occur in jail happen within the first 3 days. Again, just emphasizing that it doesn't take long, that even short stays can be incredibly destabilizing for a person and their family. And so another thing that we encourage prosecutors to do is to build relationships and to be exposed to people who have experienced the system and the consequences, and again, to just have a better understanding. And so I personally believe that those who are closest to the problem are going to be better and closer to the solutions. And so it's important that we talk to people who have the lived experience, who can really share with us like what it means when we send someone away, what happens while they're away, what services they're getting or not getting, what would actually have helped them make a different decision and not go down that path. And just to be exposed. Brian Stevenson talks a lot about proximity. I mean, I shared with you that after my own brother learned of his substance use disorder, that it certainly impacted how I looked at every drug possession case I had going forward, and having a deeper understanding that just because the court says don't use and we put you in a treatment program doesn't mean that's the nature of how this disorder works, and understanding that failure is part of the process. And so the answer can't just be, nope, all right, they used, they tested positive, go back. So just the more that we can become proximate to the problems that we're called on to help solve, not because we asked for them, but because the system has failed in so many other ways that it's ended up in the lap of the criminal legal system, but really owning that responsibility to think differently, to think critically, and to do something different than just the traditional response. And so how can we help at Vera? So in addition to just doing trainings, and the trainings aren't necessarily tied to our site engagements, what we found as we talk to prosecutors all over this country, that there is a real desire and real need to engage their staff in these conversations. And so we'll do trainings around understanding the problem of mass incarceration, understanding the need to understand more about our history and to reckon with racial injustice in our system. We'll do that just if we're asked. We'll come to the office, we'll do a training. Our more intense work, though, is our site engagement, which is really a 12 to 18 month commitment. So that is, we're going to look at your case management system, we're going to analyze your data, we're going to help you either with new or tweaking of existing policies, and then we're going to help with implementation. We're going to workshop with your staff and do the training, and then we're going to do another data pool at the end to see if what we've done together actually produces different results. And I'll just name that we're in a process right now of taking on new sites. We have an RFP out right now where we're looking to take on new offices. And so if anyone wants more information about that, I'm happy to share it. And then finally, we have an exciting initiative called our Dignity, Racial Justice, and Prosecution Initiative, where we brought together, and I'll just name it, came out of my dissatisfaction the first year or so of the work. If we are showing prosecutors in their data how their decisions are driving mass incarceration, we're showing them in their data how decisions are racially disparate. It's very easy, like in terms of addressing how you're relying on incarceration, we can talk to you concretely about policy changes and charging and bail policies. But when we show you in your data the issues with racial disparities, I didn't have like the memo to say, and this is what you do about it. And that was frustrating to me. And I realized that we needed to take on a process where we come up with something implementable and actionable in a prosecutor's office. And so I called amazing folks like Jeff Robinson and Angela Jordan Davis, who's written on these issues for more than 2 decades. We have 9 prosecutors' offices at the table, folks who are directly impacted, advocates in this space. And we've been in a process since June of every 3 to 4 weeks, working group calls, in developing guidance together that we're going to release in March of next year. And that is going to be our contribution to the field. If these are things that you care about deeply and want to take on, we're going to give you some actionable guidance that you can implement. And that is something we'll be pushing out far and wide. So I will stop there. I really intended to leave more time for question and answer. I went a little longer than I intended, but I certainly want to open it up at this point for questions. For the live stream, yes.
I was just curious, for the site engagements, are you guys currently working with sites? And are there lessons learned, or what are some of the things that people are sort of coming to grips with, or the challenges that you guys are able?
Yeah, no, so we launched, the first sites launched actually before I even came on board 2 years ago in a pilot phase. So we have worked with Duval County, Florida, Melissa Nelson's office, Scott Combs' office in Mississippi. Our longest work has been in St. Louis City with Kim Gardner's office. And we also have started a new work with Mark Dupree in Kansas City, Kansas, and have some work with Contra Costa County, California. So yes, and the lessons learned, I feel like I probably should, I could give a whole presentation on that alone, but I will name that many of them have been, we've taken those lessons of the last year and a half and put them in our RFP. And I'll just name like one thing for us. The reason why we named 12 to 18 months is we understand the work we're doing is difficult work for staff. So when we come in and give a presentation about understanding the problem of mass incarceration and telling them, yeah, the job you signed up for isn't exactly adding up, like I'm very honest about the own reckoning I had to go through. And that we know that they have to go through, and so we don't just then jump right into charging and say, all right, let's run, here's the new charging. Like, no, we do that training and then we come back in a few months, you know, and then, you know, we give people just an opportunity to do some thinking. And so, you know, there are lots of lessons learned over the last year and a half.
So, you know, I think it's very common to think about and appropriate, and I appreciate your presentation about racial disparities in incarceration, but we know from victimization surveys and other things that there are also substantial disparities. People of color are much more likely to be victims of crime. So how does that part of the equation kind of factor into your thinking about, you know, racial justice in the system?
No, that's a great question. So that is definitely something we talk about, because I think when prosecutors think of who's the population that's most likely, oh, I'm sorry, I'm not repeating the questions. I'm sorry for the folks on live stream. I apologize. The first question was about who we've been working with in our work and lessons learned. And this question is, do we consider the fact that the disparities aren't just in incarceration and on sort of the punitive side, but that there are real disparities in who's victimized by crime? And so in response to that question, yes. That is one of the things that we talk about, just because, again, if the job of a prosecutor is to help have that harm, you know, like there be some accountability, some really acknowledgement, punishment, whatever, for what happened, that we don't often think about that the actual population that's most victimized are young black men. Like that's not who we think about as the typical victim, and who would we make, you know, victims policies and push for different laws. We're not thinking about young black men, you know, and they are the population that is most victimized. And so part of this work is that we want to have a system where victims do want to engage, where they do, and part of being able to do that requires having different tools. And so, you know, one of the tools that we talk a lot about and we help offices implement is restorative justice, because that is a process that is survivors centered on the person who suffered that harm. It actually requires real accountability, because we know you can be prosecuted, convicted, sentenced and incarcerated and never actually hold yourself to account for what you did. You know, that our system is so focused on punishment, it really doesn't require accountability, and having processes that actually require that. So yes, we do consider that in the conversations and trainings. Yes, sir.
Thank you for your presentation. So I don't know if you're aware there's actually a growing literature that shows gender disparities are actually at a very similar level as racial disparities. Sonia Starr at the University of Michigan is a good example of that. And I'll share one example is domestic violence. So all the research shows that males, females it's an equal opportunity problem. Women are likely to be perpetrators as men, but look at the actual arrest. Look at, every indicator of the criminal process, there's a vast disparity of how men are treated for that particular offense compared to women. But anyway, I think that's an important piece, and you did allude to that for black men, but it turns out white men are also often subjected to these disparities.
No, thank you for answering that. It was more of a comment, not a question. And so just for folks on live stream, it was raising the aspect of the gender disparities and that, these conversations can't focus just explicitly on race.
I think one of the other impacts of the racially disparate, of our criminal justice system is the collateral impact that keeps people unemployed and not housed and really disenfranchised. And I wonder if you're doing any work on that as well.
Yeah, so for the folks on live stream, the question raised the collateral consequences that we know the result isn't just incarceration. In fact, that if people aren't ever incarcerated, they still have to deal with the inability to get jobs, to get housing, to have access to resources due to a criminal conviction. And the question was whether or not that's something we talk about or consider in our work, and we do, absolutely. I just want to name some of the slides I showed today were just sample slides that I pulled. We for every jurisdiction we go in, we do some research on what their collateral consequences are. I think the last slide I saw was 780. They're all in places you wouldn't even imagine, the types of licenses you can't have. And so again, just raising that awareness for prosecutors is definitely something we do. I think I'm just mindful of time, probably our last question.
Okay, I'll try to make it quick. So I'm a prosecutor. I'm an assistant chief deputy in an office. I'm in charge of reviewing cases as they go through the process at the information stage and other things. I like working with line deputies to come up with plea resolutions that balance accountability with helping people move past their mistakes. Because I think a lot of times you can accomplish with a misdemeanor what you would ordinarily accomplish with a felony, but without all those really heavy consequences. And again, it doesn't have that totally debilitating effect on their ability to move past that mistake and get employment and continue on a good track. And for that reason, I love misdemeanors, because you can oftentimes have people plead to a misdemeanor when someone's totally righteously charged with a felony. Again, without that, it has that balance in it. But when we talk about overcharging, I feel like I'm being hit over the head with that concept, because we don't know at the beginning of the case whether or not somebody has any interest in taking any responsibility for what happened. So let's say I have somebody who's 24 years old with no record who steals $5,000 from their employer. I know if I slap them with a felony embezzlement charge, they're probably never going to find another job again, and they'll have this in this most productive part of their life. They're going to have this very debilitating effect, and so I might really try to get a misdemeanor plea out of that, or maybe there were several embezzlements. But I believe, according to some circles, that would be a stat that shows overcharging and overreaching on our part. And so I'm really been interested in engaging in dialogue with people about how to balance that to where you're not being accused of overcharging just because you're trying to come up with solutions that are good for crimes that are righteously charged. Do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, and I just want to make sure I understand. Is it overcharging because if you're coming down from felony to misdemeanor, is it because it's a number of misdemeanors, or what makes that overcharging?
There's a lot of stat-driven and data-driven studies that focus on what did you charge versus what did you plead to. Mm-hmm. And then when what you pled to is significantly less than what you charged, then it has this automatic perception of overcharging. If somebody commits 5 residential burglaries in one night and you know they're completely righteous, and then later on you say, hey, if you take responsibility for one, we'll dismiss the rest, or I like the felony misdemeanor thing better because I feel like that's more geared towards that balance, but how would you address that?
Yeah, so for the folks on live stream, it was basically boils down to a question of if you are trying to intentionally charge what would be a felony as a misdemeanor to allow more opportunities to address the why behind the person getting involved and meet the actual needs and not saddle with a felony conviction, that will be reported in data purposes as showing how the office is overcharged by now letting people plead to misdemeanors instead of felonies. And that, you know, the argument being, well, why wasn't that just charged as a misdemeanor? And I guess in short, I think with any data, any statistic, it's important to like ask the questions. You know, like data can be used in lots of ways. And so hearing, I think, you know, if someone is asking the question and you explain to them how you just explained to us what the thinking is behind it, then that completely makes sense, you know. Yes, I do think, you know, the reason is we probably are getting pushback is because we know that a lot of people are doing that as leverage, right? You know, people are being charged with the highest possible thing. They're being charged with mandatory minimums to force a plea, and that's why there's a lot of attention on that. But I think, you know, being able to explain it and share the why behind why you're doing that in those cases would be the way to handle it. And I'm going to stop there. I'm over time. Thank you all.